So here's a fun story out of Bronze Age Britain. An excavation just outside of Bristol has uncovered around 3,000 bones, and there's clear evidence of extreme violence, dismemberment, and cannibalism. A University of Oxford study has recently determined that a cache of bones, first discovered in the 1970s, likely tells a story of a community that was brutally murdered and then cannibalized. So for today's Out mini episode, let's dive into the history of what happened to the group of Britons and what their world looked like. As usual, we'll cover the historical context. For me, the most important part of being a historian. I like to connect my stories to the bigger picture, what was happening in Britain in the Bronze Age that led to this violent event. But before we jump back in time, let's take a look at what they uncovered. There's a Bronze Age site at Charterhouse Warren, about 12 miles southwest of Bristol. And at Charterhouse Warren is a natural shaft that goes down about 20 meters, so roughly 65 feet deep. In the 70s, cavers went exploring down the Charterhouse Warren shaft and found it filled with bones at around 15 meters, so 50 feet deep. And subsequent studies show that the bones belonged to at least 37 different people, men, women, and children, which tells us it was probably an entire community. Now, archaeologists were able to date these bones back to the early Bronze Age in Britain, somewhere between 2210 and 2010 BCE. The bones had a lot of cut marks on them, showing evidence of blunt force trauma, dismemberment, and cannibalism. There were clear incisions on leg bones where the flesh was removed. There were fractures at the end of the bones that show us that bone marrow was removed. And there was even evidence of chew marks on a variety of different bones: feet, hands, and ribs. And then once eaten, these bones were tossed into the pit along with cow bones and some other animals in the area, and that's important for later. Now, these bones belonged to locals. They have similar traits and characteristics to other bones recovered from this area from that period of time. So we're not talking about like a group of invaders who came in and were dealt with. But in order to fully understand what might have happened here, we need to look at the historical context. What did Bronze Age Britain look like? And do we have evidence of other violent acts like the one uncovered at the Charterhouse Warren shaft? The Bronze Age is what follows the Neolithic period, which is also known as the New or the Late Stone Age. It was during the Neolithic period that we saw the domestication of animals, the settlement of agricultural societies, and the widespread use of metal weapons, but mainly copper. And around roughly 3000 BCE, although it does change per region, we transition into the Bronze Age, where people start using bronze. And then after the Bronze Age, for those of you curious, is the Iron Age. Now, famous things from Bronze Age Britain include Seahenge, the final touches on Stonehenge, which began back in the Neolithic period, and a new style of pottery known as beaker pottery. And also the first hill forts, though most hill forts were built during the Iron Age. Like this one at the Devil's Dyke in Brighton and Hove, which I've been to more times than I can count when visiting my grandma and granddad. See? Look at me, all excited to be on top of an Iron Age hill fort. Look at that, historian in the making. There's also a decent pub up there. I have really fond memories of the Devil's Dyke. Anywho, there were settlements all across Bronze Age Britain. No written sources, of course, just archaeological evidence. The early Britons who lived there didn't have a system of writing yet, just oral language. But the problem with only having archaeological evidence is that our picture of the past is really limited to what we've found. And in general, if there are sources from other people who did have a written language, but those are biased, right? But really, for the Bronze Age Britons, it's just archaeological evidence. And before the bone cache at Charterhouse Warren, we didn't have a lot of evidence to suggest that violent conflicts were common. And I don't mean normal spats that end in death. I'm talking the kind of violence that leads to the murder, dismemberment, and cannibalism of 37 people whose bones were then discarded down a hole. So that means that the discovery at Charterhouse Warren changes our narrative of the past, which is fascinating stuff. Or, as Professor Rick Schulting of the University of Oxford noted, quote, Charterhouse Warren is one of those rare archaeological sites that challenges the way we think about the past. It is a stark reminder that people in prehistory could match more recent atrocities and shines a light on the dark side of human behavior. That it is unlikely to have been a one off event makes it even more important that its story is told. End quote. Professor Scholting was part of the team studying these bones at Oxford. So, based on the pile of bones found, what happened? The team raises a series of questions. First, and probably most importantly, why were they cannibalized? We know that cannibalism existed in other areas of Britain, stemming all the way back to the Paleolithic period, or the Old Stone Age. In a cave in Cheddar Gorge, for example, cannibalized remains point to funeral rituals. Ritual cannibalism is certainly a thing I've talked about before. I think I last mentioned it on my episode on Kuru, the cannibal disease from Papua New Guinea, but that's not what we're seeing with this new set of bones. These bones were discarded down a hole. They weren't placed in a grave or any other kind of respectful funeral arrangement, just discarded, out of sight, out of mind, like they weren't meant to be found. Plus, if ritual cannibalism was common for Bronze Age Britons, we would have found more examples of it by now, right? Other Bronze Age sites don't have evidence of mass cannibalism and extreme violence like this, so this was a unique find. Okay, follow-up question. Were their enemies hungry? Was this just a case of survival cannibalism? Archaeologists are pretty confident that that's not what happened here. Since there are cow bones mixed in with human bones, clearly they didn't need to eat their fellow man for meat. There were other things around that they could have consumed, right? And like I said, it wasn't just cow bones, there were other animal bones down there as well. Archaeologists believe that perhaps what happened with the Charterhouse Warren group was a form of dehumanization, or othering. Here's an excerpt from the original source, which is the research article posted by those involved in the project. Quote, "This leaves cannibalism within a context of violent conflict, in which individuals are dehumanized and treated as animals. This may be best interpreted as an extreme form of violence as performance, in which the aim was to not only eradicate another group, but to thoroughly other them in the process. An event of this scale could not be hidden, and no doubt resonated across the wider region and over time. In this sense, it was a political statement. It is also highly unlikely that this was an isolated incident without precursors or consequences. That no specific evidence has been found for either is hardly surprising given the nature of the archaeological record. The purely accidental discovery of CWFS, that's the site, is salutary in this respect. Had the remains been left on the ground in the aftermath or consigned to a shallow pit, their chances of survival for millennia would have been negligible." End quote. I've linked the research article in the description, by the way, so feel free to go check out their work if you're interested in reading the source. So, in layman's terms, this violent attack was done on purpose. They were consumed as a form of dehumanization, a political act of sorts. It's unlikely that this was an isolated event, and the reason we haven't found more examples is probably just due to how archaeologists need to get lucky with where the bones are found. Because this cache was 15 meters or 50 feet underground, they were better preserved. Like the article said, if this were just a shallow mass grave, it's unlikely the bones would have survived the 4,000 plus years in between their deaths and their discoveries. Okay, so they were eaten and discarded along with cow bones to dehumanize them. So to the perpetrators, they are essentially the same as cows. But do we have any answers for why that location? Well, unfortunately, nothing concrete. We don't have evidence of, say, a massive climate event that forced the perpetrators to find a new home at Charterhouse Warren and disposing of its inhabitants when they took over. So anything we can say as to why that happened is really just speculation. There's also no genetic evidence to suggest that the two groups had different genetics, so this likely wasn't a case of conflict between different ethnicities. Professor Scholting speculates that maybe this was just part of a wider cycle of revenge killings between nearby communities. Revenge killings made up a lot of the murders in early societies. We could speculate all kinds of things, maybe theft or insult, maybe disease that isolated the group that was later killed. We may never know. Archaeologists will continue to study this site, so we may uncover more knowledge over time. But as Schulting reminds us, this was unlikely to be a one-off event, so perhaps we will find more archaeological sites like Charterhouse Warren in the future, and we'll learn even more about Bronze Age Britain society and cannibalism. My name is Kelly Beard, and thank you for listening to this F Out Mini on cannibalism in Bronze Age Britain. If you enjoyed this episode, go check out some of my other minis, or my longer podcast episodes which drop every other Sunday. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any more bloody, gross, mysterious, or weird stories from history.